Actually, I am going to talk a bit about today, but I've just written this in the last few days, and it has a slightly different title, which includes today, but it's also called Latency period. Okay, so I want to begin by thanking the organizers of this summer school, Professor Isabelle Gilles, of course, and her colleagues and supporters and team for doing me the great honor of inviting me, a European by adoption, but not by birth, not only to speak here on latencies in Europe 1914 to 2014, but in a certain sense to head off our proceedings, as it were. And I use this word head here advisedly. I'm going to come back to it in a moment. This position seems to me to incur certain obligations of addressing at least some of the broader issues that are latent in the topic of European latencies of the past century. But the immediate result of this positioning is somewhat ironic, since long before I knew any details about the program, I had decided to use as one of my guidelines, one of my headings, if you will, an essay that Jacques Derrida wrote back in 1998, which in English bears the title The Other Heading, but in French is called L'autre cap. Now, a cap in French is, of course, also a heading, but it is a point of orientation, as well as connoting many other things. Now, throughout his life, Derrida remained extremely attentive to the multiple dimensions of words in general, and in particular to the word head in many languages. And in his essay, he emphasized, among other things, the navigational function of the cap, which in English then would be rendered not as head, but as cape. He approached the question of Europe in this essay as a cape, that is, as a local entity presenting itself both as something obtrusive, obtruding from the mainland, the headland, and also as a point of orientation for others to follow. For the French word cap often signifies a reference point used in planning trips and trajectories and journeys. Now, Derrida neither simply accepted this self-presentation of Europe, nor did he entirely reject it. What he did was to complicate it by pointing to the ambiguities and ambivalences latent in the word. One historical ambiguity that this then suggested to me, although Derrida does not mention it in his essay, has to do with what is perhaps the most famous of these capes, namely the Cape of Good Hope, a promontory located far from what is called Europe, since it is near the southern tip of Africa, jutting out toward the Atlantic, toward the west. And yet, although this cape is situated far away from Europe, it is also profoundly bound up with European history. As far as most European accounts are concerned, this cape was first discovered by the Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias, who led an expedition that rounded it in 1488. However, this discovery turns out to be quite relative, since long before Dias, Herodotus, in Book 4 of his Histories, chapter 42, mentions another discovery of the same place, to be sure without using the same name. What is perhaps most remarkable about this story is the way Herodotus presents this event. Namely, he recounts how Phoenician sailors claimed to have sailed around the southern tip of what was then known as Libya and what today we call Africa. However, Herodotus recounts the event as being rather uncertain. Here's the quote from Herodotus. "These men, that is, the Phoenician sailors, made a statement which I do not myself believe, though others may, to the effect that as they sailed on a westerly course round the southern end of Libya, they had the sun on their right, northward of them. This is how Libya was first discovered from the sea," end quote. Now, I quote this passage in order to recall a point made by Walter Benjamin in his essay on the storyteller, in which he calls Herodotus the first storyteller of the Greeks. Benjamin contrasts Herodotus' style of reporting with the modern tendency, which he associates on the one hand with information, on the other hand with the novel, of explaining everything in causal terms. Herodotus, for Benjamin, exemplified the storyteller, an alternative to this, insofar as his reporting, quote, Benjamin, does not exhaust itself, but preserves its force in collected form and is therefore capable of development for a long time afterwards, end quote. Herodotus' refusal to provide a sure and certain meaning to the events he recounts is notably apparent in his attitude toward the Phoenicians' claim to have rounded the tip of Africa, quote, a statement which I, Herodotus, do not myself believe, although others may. Herodotus thus leaves it up to others, his readers in the first place, to decide upon the veracity of the Phoenicians' claim. Since some of the other storytellers Benjamin mentions in this essay include the Russian writer Nikolai Leskov, but also Montaigne, we can surmise that the two narrative tendencies he's describing, that on the one hand of providing ostensibly definitive explanations to event, and on the other that of leaving readers to decide for themselves, are both to be found in European literature, although they are clearly not limited to it, for Benjamin also refers to Scheherazade as the prototypical storyteller. And since his classification of story versus novel involves much more than only the realm of literary fiction, I want to suggest that it may well touch on at least one of the central aspects of European latencies with which we will or should be concerned during the next few days, namely, on the different ways in which singular events are related to general or even universal meanings. Now, is there anything specific to European experiences, I want to ask, in the way this relation, crucial to any cognitive discourse, is construed and practiced? One aspect of this very general question, involving the relation of universal meanings to singular events, has to do with the stability or instability of names and of naming. To what extent can names be considered proper, and to what extent can they designate stable generalities? The history of the naming of what today is known as the Cape of Good Hope, to return to this, provides a suggestive response to this question. In Herodotus, this cape is not named at all, just situated. If the sailors rounded the southern tip of Africa and continued their journey up its western coast, then they also passed by the Cape of Good Hope. But Herodotus remains skeptical about their claim, and the cape remains anonymous in his text. The first name associated with this promontory will be that one given it by Bartolomeu Diaz, but this name is not the one by which it is known today. For Diaz originally called it not the Cape of Good Hope, but something quite different, namely Il Cabo das Tormentas, the Cape of Storms or Tempests. Since, however, this particular cape, the story of its discoveries, naming and renaming, has imposed itself on me as a point of departure from which to consider some of the latencies of Europe, nothing seems more appropriate than these two names it received, Cape of Storms or Torments, as well as Cape of Good Hope. Just a few days ago, the French newspaper Libération quoted the Italian president of the council, Matteo Renzi, as declaring, I quote, "Europe was a dream for previous generations. Today, it has become for many a nightmare." End quote. So it seems as if the last years of our latency period echo increasingly the very first appellation of that distant, and yet perhaps not so distant cape, as the convergent of hopes, of storms, and yes, of torments. Now, the notion of torments takes on an increasingly sinister coloration as it removes itself from its etymological roots in the Latin word for twisting and turning, and it removes itself also from its meteorological meaning, and instead comes to signify suffering that is often intentionally provoked. To torment is to impose a kind of torture, or in any case, great pain on someone else or on oneself, and one can find ample evidence of this in European history, not just in the century designated as our latency period but long before it as well. It is true that the most obvious torments are to be found in the first half of the 20th century, during which Europe was the site of many hopeful events, but also, and perhaps even more, of extremely destructive ones. By contrast, the 69 years following the end of the Second World War have seen far less destruction, at least of a military kind, taking place on the European continent, although the loss of life elsewhere through colonial wars, neo-colonial interventions, and through indirectly provoked famines, disease, and dislocations of all sorts, may have produced as many or more casualties as those caused by the two world wars. Nevertheless, if one remains focused only on the European continent, one can say that since 1945 at least, this limited geopolitical space has been largely spared the devastating forms of military destruction that destroyed it, much of it during the first half of the 20th century. Is one therefore justified in calling this period of relative quiet following 1945 for Europe a latency period? And if so, what could this imply? What exactly is a latency period? Now, the notion of latency period, and here I'm going to just repeat in much less, competent form what Isabelle Gilles just described in her introduction. The notion of latency period was developed by Sigmund Freud to describe the decade or so separating childhood sexuality, extending roughly to about the age of 6, from the beginning of puberty and adolescence. For Freud, this latency was by no means just a synonym for virtual or potential. It involved a provisional respite in between two storms, one could say. Its beginning was rooted in what he described as the downfall of the Oedipus complex, and it lasted until the emergence of adult sexuality in adolescence, which, however, for Freud would still be marked by that complex, but in a different way. The latency period for Freud was marked not, of course, by the elimination of sexual development, but rather by the appropriation of its energies for other purposes. It was characterized by what Freud called an oscillating development, based on the failure to impose the narcissistic aims of the Oedipus period, which involved the elimination or replacement of the father figure through identification with him. Out of the failure of this project, there developed during the latency period various means for avoiding or deviating explicitly sexual drives without, however, abandoning their distinctive objectives. Freud speaks thus of the development of sublimation, of civilizing mechanisms, which, however, he also considers to be defensive devices that often make use of moral notions capable of inhibiting drives, although not of eliminating them. This notion of a latency period thus designates the temporary retreat of sexuality during a limited developmental phase, allowing the formation or strengthening of civilizing tendencies, but always against the background and in response to the more violent conflictual aspects of the sexual drives. Understood in this way, we can see how the past 70 years or so have been, especially in Europe, a period of such oscillating developments, characterized by the effort to reinforce a discourse of moral progress and of democratic ideals, but against the background of ever-growing skepticism about both. It has been, particularly since 1945, a period of reconstruction after the devastation of two world wars that was followed, however, by a period of increasing uncertainty with respect to the position of Europe in regard to rising economic competitors, above all in Asia, also in the Persian Gulf, as well as in North America. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the way was open to what today is called globalization, or, in French and Latin languages, mondialisation, a somewhat differently colored concept insofar as the word for world, monde, has a history and has semantic ambiguities that are quite different from that of globe, and this despite Shakespeare's best efforts to make the word globe into a vehicle for both theater and head, as when he has Hamlet respond to the ghost's demand, "Remember me," as follows, "Remember thee, ah, thou poor ghost, whilst memory holds a seat in this distracted globe," etc. It's the place to pronounce this, I think, in the theater. You have to ham it up a bit here. Hamlet's uncertainty as to how to respond to his murdered father's demand reflects what has been seen as a distinctive European struggle that will find philosophical expression, for instance, in the Meditations of Descartes a century later. Like Hamlet, Descartes will seek to clear his globe of all this is Hamlet now again, of all saws of books, all forms, all pressures past, end quote, in order to arrive at what might seem to be a tabula rasa of absolute certitude. It is such certitude, however, that the thinker of the latency period, Freud, like Herodotus before him, rejects. Freud acknowledges that we know very little about latency, insisting on what he calls the hypothetical nature and the deficient clarity of our insights into the process of the child's latency period, end quote. In part because we as adults are very much the product of this period, especially in our intellectual abilities and ambitions. An example of one reaction to this is the way in which the historical period we are commemorating and discussing here has been recently presented in France, where I've spent the past few weeks. There have, of course, been a large number of academic gatherings dealing with the centennial anniversary of the First World War, which marks the start of our latency period. But these remain fairly limited in scope and in effect compared to the way the televisual media, which constitute the eyes and ears of the vast majority of the population, celebrated the events of June 6, 1944. The Allied landing in Normandy has been widely depicted as the turning point of the Second World War, a gesture, however, that conveniently forgets previous and no less decisive turning points, such as the first major defeat of the Wehrmacht at Stalingrad in 1942 and the no less significant defeat of the German army in the tank battles around Kursk in 1943, all well before the landing in Normandy. Instead, the presence of President Putin at the commemoration of the Allied landing, and even more, the snubbing of him by President Obama, became the focus of public and media attention, reviving in farcical form the sense of moral superiority of the West, reminiscent of the atmosphere of the Cold War. This personalization of politics and its consequent effacement of its complex histories converge with the tendency to treat its military convulsions strictly from a heroicizing perspective that celebrates the victors and demonizes the vanquished. But what is no less striking here is the tendency toward what Freud in his later life identified as isolation. Isolation, he discovered, accomplishes much the same thing as the more familiar repression, but in a more sophisticated manner. Not by blocking out from consciousness the offending idea or thought, but rather by isolating it from its consequences. And since it is generally the consequences that turn out to be unacceptable to self-consciousness, the actual idea itself could be allowed to appear as long as its effect, which made it problematic in the first place, could be eliminated. Freud notes in passing, however, that it is very difficult to see this mechanism as strictly pathological, since it is also at the heart of so many of our conscious, rational thought processes, as the notion of concentration or focusing indicate. And indeed, some sort of isolation is unavoidable to a finite consciousness, lest it lapse into an infinite regress of interrelationships. Nevertheless, what Freud's notion of isolation emphasizes, I believe, is that any cut-off point, any period, however necessary and unavoidable, will always be partial and potentially, latently perhaps, related to what it excludes from itself. That is, it will never be simply self-identical or all-encompassing. Thus, any periodization, qua period, will inevitably be latent, will inevitably be a latency period, like the period in a sentence, which it inevitably brings to a stop, but never to a full stop. The celebration or commemoration or analysis of 1914 or 1944 or any other date falling within our period, thus, should remain open, which is to say as open as possible, to its antecedents as well as to its consequences. The satisfaction of delimiting should never blind one to the inevitability of exclusion. Thus, it can be argued that the wars falling within our latency period and determining its post-war phase until today must themselves perhaps be placed in a larger and longer context if they are to be productively understood. Even in terms of sheer destructiveness, the 60 million dead caused by the Second World War, and who knows how many wounded, may have been a smaller portion of the European population than those affected by the 30 Years' War of religion from 1614 to 1641, in which, by best estimates, 20 to 45% of the population of the German-speaking countries on whose territory this conflict took place were killed. The Treaty of Westphalia, that put a provisional end to this conflict in 1648, is generally considered to have established the basis for what today in English is called international law, and what in German has a somewhat different name deriving from the Latin, namely Völkerrecht, jus gentium. This treaty guaranteed the right of the ruler of a territory to determine the official religion of that area, the choice, of course, being limited to Catholicism, Lutheranism, or Calvinism, as well as the rights of the minority Christians in each state to practice their religion, but within specific temporal and spatial limits set by the government. The universalist claims of the Catholic Church were thus subordinated to the sovereign power of local rulers and regimes, but the no less universalist claims of Christianity as a religion remained entirely in force. There is every reason, I believe, to see in this readjustment of political and religious claims one origin, at least, of modern international relations, as well as of the conflicts that culminated in the destructive paroxysms of the First and Second World Wars. There's also every reason to surmise that it is this history that weighs significantly on the way in which European unity and the European Union is being determined today. The country today known as Germany, and which is of relatively recent political origin, has long been shaped by conflicts arising from the wars of religion. The dominant ideological position that has determined German political and economic policy since 1945 bears the distinctive name social market economy. The only difference between right and left in this respect is on which of the terms, these two terms, the emphasis is placed, social or market. Both, however, agree on their mutual inevitability. Now, this notion was introduced in 1946 by the German economist Alfred Müller-Arnack, and it has become the dominant economic and political ideology of post-war Germany, from Adenauer and Erhard to Gerhard Schröder, and I would also argue to Angela Merkel. Müller-Arnack displayed a significant historical awareness when he designated the social market economy as what he called an irenic formula, designed to reconcile the private interests of the market with the public interests of society, capital with labor. The word irenic, from the Greek irene, meaning peace, goes back to a text published in 1593 by the Protestant theologian Franz Junius the Elder under the title Irenicum, which sought to promote a reconciliation of Catholic and Protestant warring factions following the devastating wars of religion. The fact that the leitmotif of post-war German socio-economic ideology presented itself as a compromise deriving from that envisaged between the two major factions of Western Christianity seems particularly significant given the fact that the idea of a social market economy has not only become the shibboleth of a reunified Germany, but has also found its way into the Lisbon Treaty, which became effective on December 1st, 2009. Article 2 of this treaty begins by stating the Union's aim is to promote peace, its values, and well-beings of its people. And the third section then says, the Union shall establish an internal market. It shall work for the sustainable development of Europe based on balanced economic growth and price stability, a highly competitive social market economy aiming at full employment and social progress. Now, the Christian notion of redemption, I believe, permeates the economic thinking of this social market economy, which, in order to be highly competitive, as the Lisbon Treaty demands, must be able, in this perspective at least, to remain credit-worthy. To be credit-worthy, debts must be redeemable in full, which in the given system means repaying debts incurred together with the specified interest in a specified time frame. The contemporary German insistence on austerity as a path to economic, political, and national well-being reflects a mode of thinking that is not just pragmatic, accepting unquestionably the logic of a market intent on maximizing profit rather than facilitating the production and exchange of goods. It is also, I want to argue, ultimately theological. Man is indebted to his Creator. His debts, like his sins, are self-incurred and must be redeemed. Redemption holds out the promise of a return that can bring with it the surplus value of a higher, better, and perhaps eternal life. Thus, any analysis of European latencies has to take into account, I believe, a Christian dimension of what can be called Europe's secularized economic theology, in which the market stands alongside the state as the providential path to security and salvation. There are, to be sure, a number of other factors that have contributed to the genealogy of the latencies with which we are concerned. Some of these have been analyzed in a remarkable study by my colleague at Northwestern, Michael Loriot, entitled European Union and the Deconstruction of the Rhineland Frontier. Loriot identifies two distinct discursive myths, as he puts it, that have informed attitudes about Europe and that continue, as he writes, to constrain EU debate in our day. These consist, on the one hand, in, quote, an oceanic representation of Europe as a patchwork of ancient nations defined by language and culture, going back, of course, to the fictional 18th century epic authored by James McPherson, and on the other hand, what he calls a Carolingian representation of Europe as a site of moral improvement. The same word Europe, he observes, connotes a space that is home and nursery to nations and that is site to a progressive project to transcend nationhood, end quote. Now, these two discourses, both latent in the ostensibly proper name or noun Europe, pull in different directions. The Carolingian tending to minimize what Loriot sees as the necessary task of frontier deconstruction by extending and indeed universalizing the meaning of Europe, whereas the Oceanic perspective focuses on perpetuating frontiers through its affirmation of territorial locality as the quintessence of the European project. It thereby tends to avoid the question of the deconstruction of frontiers, inner and outer. Against both of these tendencies, Loriot argues that what the EU is really about is the task of deconstructing the myth of the Rhineland frontier, understood, that is, as an essentially binary structure, separating self-identical nations from each other, and in particular Germany and France, in order to rediscover, he argues, to deconstruct this myth, in order to rediscover what he calls a different style of political organization, one that would be plurilingual, less hierarchical, legitimated by cultural inventiveness rather than by the obligation to preserve identity as legacy. A space, something like this, he argues, once extended from northern Italy to the Netherlands and beyond. And it existed independently of the territorial monarchies that arose and prior to the reorganization of these monarchies as nation states, end quote. Now, I wanted to briefly recall these theses of Michael Loriot because I believe they can help us better understand the contemporary developments in the European Union, which can be seen as an ongoing struggle between Ossianic, local, and Carolingian universalizing conceptions. But even this alternative strikes me as still too polarized and simplistic if it is not articulated with a more general consideration of the notion of identity, informing both the concept of local and universal. And it is here that the essay mentioned by Derrida can speak to the crisis that Europe is undergoing today. Derrida wrote his essay in response to a small colloquium dedicated to the question of European cultural identity. And he began his text with what he called an axiom. I quote Derrida: "What is proper to a culture is never to be identical to itself. Not to have any identity, but to be able to identify itself, to say me or we only in the non-identity to itself, or if you prefer, only in the difference with itself. There is no culture or cultural identity without this difference with itself. What differs and diverges from itself would also be a difference from and with itself, a difference both internal and yet irreducible to being simply at home, chez soi." Even, end quote. Even this axiom, from this axiom, Derrida then derives the following as one of his most important consequences. Quote, "This difference," he wrote, "gathers and divides the hearth of the home irremediably. In truth, it only gathers it, bringing it back to itself to the extent that it opens it to this divergence," end quote. As a general argument, this axiom of Derrida's is surely familiar to many of you. But what I find both moving and incisive in this essay of 1990 is the way it applies this axiom not just to generalities, nations, states, and cultures, but to the tension between the collective and the singular, between the we and the I. To be able to say me or we, he writes, should entail an awareness of non-identity. It is also this tension that distinguishes what I would call the singular from the individual. Those words often used synonymously. If the latter, individual, is generally understood tacitly or explicitly as involving self-identity, literal indivisibility, the former, singular, is fundamentally relational, differential, heterogeneous, and what Derrida would call ultimately aporetic. This conflict between individuality and singularity, I want to suggest, has been on the European agenda ever since the Reformation. Its genealogy, however, can be traced much further back to the biblical book of Genesis, and it remains part of the Christian dimension of the European experience. Derrida, however, writes about this experience as one who has come to it from a certain outside, an outside that, however, was never simply external, since it involved the experience of someone born and raised outside of Europe, although in a European colonial context. But for Derrida, this complex extraterritoriality was complicated further by the fact that he came from an assimilated Jewish family living in a predominantly Muslim and Christian world. All of this gave him a unique perspective from which to experience the heterogeneity of what is called Europe, and in particular, France. In this essay of 1990, he begins by observing that something unique is on the move in Europe, in what is still called Europe, even if one no longer knows for certain what this word names, to what concept, to what real individual, to what singular entity this name should be assigned today. He then goes on to make a rather surprising confession. He writes, "I will confide in you a feeling, that of an old European feeling somewhat exhausted. More precisely, of someone who, without being entirely European by birth, since I come from the southern shore of the Mediterranean, considers himself increasingly with the years a kind of European mixed blood, combining something of Europe's age with the youth of the other shore. It is this feeling that produces the first of the two axioms of this little talk. I will say we instead of I, another manner of passing surreptitiously from feeling to axiom," end quote. Now, it is this not-so-surreptitious passage from feeling to axiom, not surreptitious because he mentions it as being surreptitious, that I think should concern us today. if we are interested at least in the survival of something called Europe, distinct from the different nation-states that comprise it and define its territory. Underlying his axiomatization, Derrida suggests, is what he calls a feeling, and perhaps not just any feeling. In this particular case, the writer, reflecting on European cultural identity, its history, traditions, and above all its future, acknowledges a feeling of weariness, whose significance, I want to argue, goes far beyond whatever personal experiences he may have been having at the time. If Derrida's weariness can speak to us today, and in the context of a discussion of latencies of Europe, I think it must have to do with the shared situation of finitude common to singular living beings, which is set off by the expectation that our subject matter, Europe, would somehow elevate us temporarily at least above such feelings of vulnerability. Derrida's acknowledgement of a certain fatigue, of the weight of singularity, of the vulnerability that living beings can feel in their corporeal, material existence, demands a response or an echo from any discourse that would articulate latencies of Europe or any other geopolitical entity. It is perhaps this singular latency of Europe that its political institutions at both the national and supranational level tend all too easily to forget or to subsume. Such subsumption opens the way for the feelings of rage and disgust to which programs such as the French National Front appeal. That this party, as you doubtless know, received the most votes in the recent European parliamentary election in France. Its program attacks the European Union for acting as a bureaucratic superstate at the expense of what it calls people's purpose. But its notion of people is construed essentially as a monolithic and above all homogeneous collection of individuals, which it defines practically, if not explicitly, through its constant critique of immigration and of immigrants. The mobilizing force of this appeal to what Carl Schmitt describes as the friend-enemy grouping draws its energies, I want to argue, from the disastrous economic and political policies of the European Union over the past years, but also from the hypocrisy surrounding immigration policies directed primarily by the desire to drive down labor costs rather than that of enriching a nation through cultural diversity. Moreover, the political power of xenophobic programs, especially in a time of economic crisis and increasing inequality, also draws support from a longer tradition going back, as I've already suggested, to what can be called a monotheological identity paradigm that I believe continues to inform the modern secular sense of self. This paradigm, as already mentioned, can be traced back to the book of Genesis, and it is intensified perhaps and individualized by the notion of a God capable of having a son who can lead an earthly existence in order to redeem mankind from its guilt. Such humanization of the divine involves the tendency of a deification of man. One of its results can be seen in the way individual identity is construed and formed. Jacques Lacan has given us a trenchant analysis of some of these implications, political as well as individual, in his famous essay on the mirror stage. Identification with one's mirror image as a decisive stage in the development of the ego involves both transformation of the other, epitomized in the inversion of the mirror image, into a representation of the same. The practice of the audiovisual media today, and above all of its televisual representation of what's called the news, strongly reinforces such imaginary mechanisms of identification by reducing the complex historical, social, political, and economic relationships to simple statements of easily identifiable visible speakers, called not by accident in the United States anchors. What they do, in effect, is to anchor imaginity or frame the symbolic potential of signifying images by framing them through giving them an apparent unity and individuality as visible and audible phenomena, one could say by eliminating their latencies. This, together with the representation of professional sports, say this as one who's avidly following the World Cup, organizes relations and conflicts into binary oppositions in which there is always apparently a clear-cut winner and loser, an oppositional structure reinforcing the priority of what can be called a self-identical ego over an other, construed primarily as an alter ego. The tried and tested political exploitation of this imaginary identification involves the transformation of uncertainty into certainty, of anxiety into fear, and finally of fear into aggression addressed at a scapegoat. This transformation of anxiety into fear and of fear into aggression provides short-term relief while constantly reproducing and aggravating underlying dependencies, which means it must be constantly renewed and augmented in intensity. The renewable, all too renewable energies of imaginary identification, seeking to reduce the other to a subset of the same, can therefore be exploited as a means of political mobilization. This can provide, as I say, temporary relief by replacing the anonymity of institutions and of their systemic interconnections with a more or less human face that can be located and, if necessary, effaced or destroyed, especially where that face is identified with the most vulnerable members of the national community, foreigners and minorities in all forms. At the same time, this process reinforces the basic principle of a system that produces increasing inequality and insecurity in the first place. And this is the principle of what I would call unbridled, private, individual appropriation of wealth and power. No political party without a charismatic leader, no corporation without its star CEO, no country without its visible richest citizens. I've only had time to suggest that the religious history of Europe, and perhaps elsewhere, contributes to this continuing fascination with imaginary xenophobic identification. Such identification finds a resource, which is not to say that an inevitable determinant, in the ambiguity of the notion of image, an ambiguity dating at least from the account in the book of Genesis, where man is said to have been created in the image of God, and where this image is equated with likeness. This account of a monotheistic creation of world, of life, and of human beings lays, I believe, the groundwork for a notion of identity that subordinates the singularity of living beings to the individuality of a universal and exclusive creator God. This coupling, in the King James Version at least, of image with likeness is from the very beginning, however, a source of uncertainty and of conflict. For if man is created in the image of his creator and moreover in his likeness, just which of the creator's attributes can he legitimately aspire to have? Immortality, self-identity, uniqueness coupled with universality, absolute knowledge? The fall of man and the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden is only the first result of this ambiguity. Another response is when occurs when the whole world was still of one language and when men set about to build, quote, build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven and make us a name lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. The city and tower of Babel is thus designed to create a union or to preserve the idea of a unification that would bring humans closer to the divine and thereby perhaps avoid the fate of being scattered abroad the face of the whole earth. This first attempt at what might be called globalization, the effort, for example, to preserve a single language for all mankind, results precisely in the opposite, in the diversity of language and the scattering of humans across the globe. Multilinguality and geopolitical diversity, however, are thus represented as punishments for the effort to construct human unification in the imitation of the one God. And yet, as his creatures, created in his likeness, were these humans not simply following the destiny inscribed in the myth of a monotheistic, self-identical creator God? Today, we can justifiably pose the question of whether the current period of globalization does not tend to repeat the latent European and pre-European dream of domesticating heterogeneity, alterity, and singularity. The temptation here, which survives and flourishes in what we think of as secular societies, seek to make its own the response given by God to Moses when asked to provide his name. God replies, I am that I am. Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you, end quote. It seems, however, that the more Europe would like simply to say, I am, the less its being is being taken for granted. And this is perhaps because it has underestimated the leap from moving from I to we, in moving from local to general, from singular to universal, in increasingly defining itself as a financial entity committed to a pact of stability. The European Union has equated stability with the minimization of debt and with the control of time. Latency then becomes the production of the same, but with a surplus. But this is a latency that denies latency, at least in the Freudian and probably other senses of the word. For it seeks to present itself as perennially self-same rather than as a period that must inevitably come to an end. But perhaps coming to an end can transform itself in the process. By contrast, the recognition of finitude in politics today seems to be strongest among ecological movements, who remain also active, although a minority, in Europe today. Europe still functions to bring together diverse groups and perspectives without necessarily insisting on a bottom line or a globalizing unification. The latencies of today need not be those of tomorrow, and the possibility of transformative latency, as Derrida emphasizes in the other heading, is already legible in the word today, which does not simply designate the self-contained immediacy of an indivisible present moment. Rather, in English and also in French, the word today can be read and heard as the mark of a split, of a division, making the day into a destination, rather than taking it for granted. In this word, the day makes way for the prefix to, involving a movement toward rather than a straightforward state. What holds for today also holds for Europe today. It retains the hope that what is coming may yet be different from what has been. But that hope can only survive to the extent that the compact self-identity of words such as today, but also of market, capital, people, union, and of course latency in Europe, are all allowed to acknowledge their internal divisions and thus open themselves to their transformative latencies. Such an opening can never take the form of an apodictic announcement advanced under the cover of sure and certain knowledge, nor can it result from a simple demand. Rather, I believe it must proceed also from feelings that acknowledge what conceptual knowledge can never entirely comprehend. Such feelings, love, hate, anxiety, frustration, etc., must not be afraid to express themselves in stories, leaving to others the task of responding, perhaps with the question that, according to Walter Benjamin, marks the end of every genuine story and the beginning of the next, namely the question, and what happens next? Thank you.